Good afternoon and welcome to the opening event of the Nordic Craft Week 2021, where we share our Nordic craft heritage. My name is Tarmo Tuuström and I'm working in the Finnish Craft Organisation Taito as a coordinator of intangible cultural heritage. Today's topic is very much living heritage, as this live broadcast is an online workshop of visible mending. And that is a skill that is very actual even in the age of information. During this broadcast, I will act as a moderator for comments and questions, which I encourage you to write to us at any point of the broadcasting. And as some of you might have noticed, you can also send photos of your own visible mendings either via email or via WhatsApp. The address and phone number are below. Take them to your phone or write them down, because it won't be visible there for all the time. Anyway, you can also ask them in the comments if you miss it. And in the end of this workshop, we will take a look of your shared photos and discuss the topic even further. Now it is the time for me to stop talking and let the experts come to front. Ladies and gentlemen, let us first welcome Johanna Lumila to the studio.
Thank you, Tarmo. It was nice to hear you speak.
Thank you.
Welcome everyone from my part as well. We're so happy that you joined us in this visible mending workshop live from Finland. My name is Johanna, as Tarmo said, and I'm stationed in Oulu, in the center part of Finland, as far up north on the map as Reykjavik is in Iceland. With us today we have Elina. Maybe Tarmo can show a piece of Elina.
Hello everybody. I'm here in Turku and I have mended these socks of this workshop. I hope you enjoy this workshop.
Thank you. Okay, Elina is located in Turku, in the beautiful archipelago of the Baltic Sea. It's a very nice city. I wish for everyone to visit it sometime. Of course, the man who is the master of ceremony today was Tarmo, or is Tarmo, and he sits in Helsinki. So this live broadcast is sent from three different countries. From three different cities in Finland. So let's keep our fingers crossed that all goes as planned. Our subject for today is visible mending, which is part of the handicraft theme Mending and Patching, chosen by the Finnish Craft Organisation Taito. Mending and patching is the main theme for the year 2021. In Finnish we say parsinta ja paikkaus. Taito, founded in 1913, is today the leading provider and an active producer and developer of craft services and education in workshops and craft schools all over the country. Taito was named by UNESCO in September 2020 as an accredited handicraft expert in the field of intangible cultural heritage, and our goal is to remain being part of it in the future as well. And as Tarmo mentioned, he is also involved with the work. There are 16 Taito crafts associations with a large number of local craft centers throughout the country. The associations are all independent. They have their own organizations, and the craft centers offers anyone who is interested in handicraft all kinds of workshops in the area where they are located. And then there are 23 regional Taito shops, which are run by the associations regionally. Taito Shop is the largest marketing chain for Finnish crafts, and it offers locally made products with a personal touch that stand the test of time. Okay, so that's who we are and what we do. Let's start talking about visible mending. Why should we mend when we can buy new stuff to replace broken or worn out things? Well, the main reason is because the world is drowning in thrown away objects, and we just have to choose to live more sustainably in the future. Instead of getting rid of broken, worn out, and rejected things, let's try to make a difference by choosing to repair, mend, and rebuild. You can be a smarter consumer by not having to replace things you can easily repair. Darning and mending in earlier times was tradition. We had an urge to repair and mend in most cultures and families all over the world. We did it because we had to and because we believed we should. This is where we come in to giving garments and pieces of clothing an extended life. The environment needs it as well as the whole world does, so let's take a stand and recycle what we can with what we have. Did you know that pupils and students in Finland in the beginning of the 1900s had a school program where you learned how to mend and darn? I have a colleague who mentioned that her grandmother had learned to mend clothes in school in her youth. She still has her grandmother's school certificate of it as a token for the future. So how do you mend your clothes, garments, and accessories? Well, first you need to have some tools. They're not expensive, quite the opposite. Needles can be purchased for little money. A roll of yarn or thread doesn't cost much. And if you're mending clothes made of fabric, it's easy to find scraps to use for mending. If you can't find anything you already have, ask your friends or relatives for help. Maybe someone has a stash of old clothes to give away. To mend a hole or a worn out spot in a sock can be done in many different ways and by using many techniques. To mend visibly is easier than to make it invisible. Traditionally, we mend and darn by making a weave into the sock. You'll see examples of that later. You create a warp with yarn into the surface of the sock, and then you weave in a weft to cover a hole or an almost worn out spot. The technique creates a sort of basket weave that covers the hole or strengthens a thinned out part. That's the most used darning technique, I suppose. In this workshop, we mend socks with blanket stitches in 3 different ways. The blanket stitch is really versatile when it comes to mending. You can use it to make patches that are round, square-shaped, and rectangular. Even triangles can be made with it. A mend made with blanket stitches almost looks like crochet. Try out and combine different darning techniques freely. You'll soon learn which one suits you the best. For darning in this workshop, you'll need a darning needle, in other words, a tapestry needle. I'll show you. I hope you can see this. This is a blunt needle that is used for sewing into knit pieces. The eye of the needle is quite large. You can see the large eye here, I hope. So you'll be even able to use heavy yarn and use to darn with. You can find tapestry needles in many sizes in shops that provide handicraft material. Then you'll need either a darning mushroom or a similarly round or curved object that fits into the sock to be placed directly under the hole. I've seen apples and oranges used, so whatever object you choose, either a darning mushroom or another thing, tie a string or a band underneath it to hold the object in place while you're darning. And last, but definitely not least, yarn. colorful, bold, thick or thin. The choice is really up to you. Be brave and use your imagination. The world is full of colorful yarn. And using Taito Group's slogan, which says that craft is happiness, we hope that the socks you'll be darning makes you as happy as we feel when looking at all our and your colorful mended socks. So let's get to the video we have made, where we show you how to darn with blanket stitches in 3 different ways.
There are many ways for mending garments visibly. In this video, we show you how to darn socks in 3 ways using only one stitch, the blanket stitch. With the blanket stitch, it's possible to form shapes like circles, oblongs, and oval shapes, squares, and triangles onto surfaces you want to cover. You can sew the stitches into the surface of the garment or just sew into the stitches on previous rows. The first clip, in a row of 3 in this video, shows you how to mend an almost worn out spot on the sock. The mended patch looks almost like a little sun or a small wheel. In the second clip, the blanket stitches fill in and cover a quite large hole in the sock completely. In the third clip, you'll learn how to make a square patch using the blanket stitch anchored to a warp thread across and underneath each row of stitches. When darning and mending socks visibly, you'll need a darning mushroom, tapestry needles, and colorful yarn with a thickness close to the yarn used in the sock you're working on. Mending with blanket stitches.
And excuse me, there's a small technical problem. The video was not working as it should. There was a small problem. Let's try it again. This is
Across and underneath each row of
now
stitches.
it works.
When darning and mending socks visibly, you'll need a darning mushroom, tapestry needles, and colorful yarn with a thickness close to the yarn used in the sock you're working on. Mending with blanket stitches when you have a spot on the sock that's almost worn out or thinned out. Mending with blanket stitches when you have a spot on the sock that's almost worn out or thinned out. Choose a starting point anywhere near the edge of the worn out spot on the sock you want to strengthen. Pull the needle and yarn through the sock and to the front where you want the edge of the shape to be. You can choose the starting point anywhere around the edge. Leave a tail for weaving in later when you have finished sewing the shape. Slide the needle sideways to the right, needle pointing upwards, and push the needle into the knit and about 5 millimeters up and through to the front. Pull the needle and yarn all the way through to the surface. Be sure to wrap the yarn under the needle and make a loop for the yarn to be hooked in. The stitch made looks a bit like a half square or a horseshoe, if you will. Repeat the stitch, but leave some space between the new and the previous stitch. The spacing is really up to you, but it's important in the beginning to not place the stitches too close to each other, as you will continue darning in a spiral shape and the space between each new stitch will become smaller as you continue on. Elina, who is darning in all of these 3 clips in this video, has chosen a round form for this first clip, since that is the easiest shape when it comes to mending garments with blanket stitches. This kind of darning doesn't have to cover the whole spot completely, it's just supposed to strengthen the worn out part on the sock and to have the garment from wearing out in the near future. Continue darning the stitches in a circle around the edge of the thinned out spot. When you've completed this first row of stitches around the hole and you're back to where you started, Make the first stitch on the second row into both the surface of the sock where your worn out stitches are and into the blanket stitch you made on the previous row. From now on, you'll be sewing new blanket stitches into every stitch on every row. Just remember to always catch both the knit stitches on the sock and the previous blanket stitches on lower rows. Also, do not...
And excuse again, I will try to resync the video. There's some technical difficulties with the broadcasting software. The video was not aligned with the sound, which many of you might have noticed. My apologies. All the test runs didn't show any problem or difficulties, so let's try this time and hope it works as it should.
Since that is the easiest shape when it comes to mending garments with blanket stitches. This kind of darning doesn't have to cover the whole spot completely. It's just supposed to strengthen the worn out part on the sock and to have the garment from wearing out in the near future. Continue darning the stitches in a circle around the edge of the thinned out spot. When you've completed this first row of stitches around the hole and you're back to where you started, make the first stitch on the second row into both the surface of the sock where your worn out stitches are and into the blanket stitch you made on the previous row. From now on, you'll be sewing new blanket stitches into every stitch on every row. Just remember to always catch both the knit stitches on the sock and the previous blanket stitches on lower rows. Also, do not make the stitches too high, since you want to strengthen the thinned out spot. If the rows are too high, the patch won't look neat and flat. If you're unsure of how your stitches will look, practice on some scrap fabric, and when you're sure about the stitches, start darning on your worn out socks. It's always possible to unravel the stitches by removing the needle and pulling the sewn yarn out if you're not satisfied. If the yarn...
And it seems that this problem didn't disappear, so I'll try to reload the video again, as the first uploading didn't really work as planned. So let's try again. And most likely fresh start usually.
There are many ways for mending garments visibly. In this video, we show you how to darn socks in 3 ways using only 1 stitch.
And I'll rewind it to the section where it actually starts. And let's start from here again with better luck.
On the sock you want to strengthen. Pull the needle and yarn through the sock and to the front where you want the edge of the shape to be. You can choose the starting point anywhere around the edge. Leave a tail for weaving in later when you have finished sewing the shape. Slide the needle sideways to the right, needle pointing upwards, and push the needle into the knit and about 5 millimeters up and through to the front. Pull the needle and yarn all the way through to the surface. Be sure to wrap the yarn under the needle and make a loop for the yarn to be hooked in. The stitch made looks a bit like a half square or a horseshoe, if you will. Repeat the stitch, but leave some space between the new and the previous stitch. The spacing is really up to you, but it's important in the beginning to not place the stitches too close to each other, as you will continue darning in a spiral shape and the space between each new stitch will become smaller as you continue on. Elina, who is darning in all of these 3 clips in this video, has chosen a round form for this first clip, since that is the easiest shape when it comes to mending garments with blanket stitches. This kind of darning doesn't have to cover the whole spot completely. It's just supposed to strengthen the worn out part on the sock and to have the garment from wearing out in the near future. Continue darning the stitches in a circle around the edge of the thinned out spot. When you've completed this first row of stitches around the hole and you're back to where you started, make the first stitch on the second row into both the surface of the sock where your worn out stitches are and into the blanket stitch you made on the previous row. From now on, you'll be sewing new blanket stitches into every stitch on every row. Just remember to always catch both the knit stitches on the sock and the previous blanket stitches on lower rows. Also, do not make the stitches too high, since you want to strengthen the thinned out spot. If the rows are too high, the patch won't look neat and flat. If you're unsure of how your stitches will look, practice on some scrap fabric, and when you're sure about the stitches, start darning on your worn out socks. It's always possible to unravel the stitches by removing the needle and pulling the sewn yarn out if you're not satisfied. If the yarn gets tangled up, which it often does when sewing by hand, just let go of the needle and hang the yarn from the sock to untangle it. Or untangle it by hand by stretching the yarn out. The blanket stitch is a very expressive stitch, since it can be used on so many fabrics, garments, and clothing. You can sew it onto edges on all kinds of cloth like blankets, handkerchiefs, and table runners. You can neaten small holes on clothes with it and even sew together fabric layers with it. Blanket stitches always have consistent spacing between each stitch. If you make the stitches closer to the other, it's called the buttonhole stitch. But that stitch is not our subject for today. If you are left-handed, the stitch is basically the same, but you sew from right to left, mirroring the process. Now continue darning in spirals until you reach the very center of the shape and your form is complete. In this first clip, the darning mushroom has been placed inside the sock before we started filming, but you'll be able to see how to do that part later on in the video. Sew into every stitch on the previous row. Don't jump over any stitches because it's not necessary when you have space between. And as I mentioned about the height of the stitches before, don't make them too high either. It's possible to form shapes like circles, oblongs, and oval shapes, squares and triangles onto surfaces you want to cover. If you, for example, chose to make shapes that has corners, you will have to jump over stitches in all corners on every row. Otherwise, you'll end up with a cylinder-formed shape that rises from the surface. So if you end up wanting a shape with corners, practice on scrap fabric and you'll soon notice where and how to reduce stitches in the corners of the shape. This shape has 4 blanket rows, so it's very easy and quick to finish. It's decorative and eye-catching. It looks nice with colorful contrasting yarn on striped or non-striped garments. The choice of colors is really up to you. Choose what inspires you the most. So when you are finished on the front and you have reached the center of the shape, loosen the string that holds the darning mushroom in place and take out the mushroom. Push in your hand into the sock and push the needle into the center of the mend and out through the back surface of the sock. Turn the sock over to clean up all loose ends of yarn. With your needle, weave in the tail of the yarn by sewing into the backs of the stitches to avoid the yarn from unraveling or coming undone, and for the sock to be comfortable to wear. In the middle of the mend, weave the yarn into the stitches in a circle. Never make knots, since they are not secure when wearing a garment as stretchy as a sock. Cut off the yarn, thread the needle This time we show you how to weave in the yarn in a zigzag way. Sew the first row and catch a few backs of the stitches. Turn and sew to the opposite side. Turn again and sew under the backs of the stitches. This is kind of like a zigzag form. Cut the yarn and turn your sock back so you can see the front and the finished shape. Steam the patch for a neat finish. And you're done. Nice work. In this second clip, you'll learn how to mend a sock that already has a hole in it. Push the darning mushroom into the sock, just underneath the hole, and secure the sock to the mushroom by tying a band or a piece of string underneath the hat of the mushroom. This is for holding the sock in place while you're darning, since it's easier to handle when nothing is moving around uncontrollably. Take a piece of yarn that is close to the thickness your socks have been knit with. Thread the tapestry needle and push the needle into the sock, some 5 centimeters from the edge of the hole you'll be covering. Pull the needle and yarn to the front, close to the edge of the hole, and leave a tail for weaving in later. Remember to do this every time you begin darning with a new yarn. You'll see this later on when we run out of yarn. Sew a row of running stitches around the hole just to secure the broken surface around the opening. The purpose of the running stitch in this case is for holding the knit together so that the edges of the hole doesn't stretch. The running stitch is probably the most basic stitch in hand sewing because it's useful for so many different projects, from joining layers of fabric together to making decorative projects with different shapes and colors. Load the stitches onto the needle, about 3 at a time, depending on where you are in the mend and how long your needle is. How many is up to you. There's no rule for this. Pull the needle through. Repeat until you've reached all the way back to where you started. Start sewing blanket stitches around the hole. This mend requires for a little more closer stitches than in the first clip, as you will have to cover the hole completely and you don't want any gap to be seen through the mend. Continue sewing a full circle around the gap. Maybe I should mention that if your socks has ends and bits of yarn around the holes and looks a bit messy, it would be good to clean the edges with scissors by cutting off all loose and broken yarn ends before you start mending. Let's speed up this video a bit. When you reach the first blanket stitch made in the beginning, push the needle into the previous stitch on the row below. There's no surface or knit stitches on the sock underneath, so it's quite obvious that you have to make new stitches into the earlier made ones on previous rows. Sew a new stitch into every stitch underneath. Sew them in a spiral to the very end of your mend. Continue sewing until you run out of yarn, and when you do, push the needle into the mending and out through the sock on the side. Leave a few centimeters between the mend and where you push out the needle to the front. The yarn chosen to mend with in this clip has been dyed with plants, and choosing different shades in every new piece of yarn will make the mend look very interesting. Take a new piece of yarn, rethread the needle and push the needle into the sock at some distance from the mend and out exactly where you left your last made stitch. Remember to always leave a tail of yarn to be woven in later, just like you did when you started. Continue as before by sewing all the way around in a spiral. If the yarn gets tangled up, and as I mentioned before, it really does and sometimes quite often, let go of the needle and yarn and hang it from the sock or untangle it by hand, stretching the yarn by pulling on it. When the gap in the sock gets smaller, you will have to reduce the number of stitches on each row in order to keep the stitches flat as you work towards the center. Reducing the stitches is quite easy. You just jump over a stitch underneath and continue sewing into the next one. The more you get to the center of the mend, you'll probably have to jump over every other stitch to still keep the work flat. Continue like this until the gap is totally covered and you're satisfied with your mending. Remember that it's always possible to unravel the stitching if your mend looks bulky, which would mean that you have too many stitches in the mend and too close to the other. We don't have footage on unraveling darned mending, but if you would need to unravel stitches, first remove the needle from the yarn and with your needle pull on the blanket stitches one by one until you reach the part that still stays flat. Rethread the needle and continue. So, when you're finished mending, loosen the string around the foot of the mushroom, remove it and the string, and turn the sock over and start cleaning up all loose ends of yarn. Weave in the tail of the yarn by sewing into the backs of the stitches and into the edge of the gap. There are different ways to weave in tails of yarn when you're finished working. Either sew into the backs of the blanket stitches or into the side of the sock edge. Cut off the end of the yarn. The mend looks really nice and flat, and you can see the different shades of the plant dyed yarn. Catch the yarn from all of the beginnings by pulling on the threads and pull them to the inside of the sock. You'll see where they are as you left long stitches beside the mend every time you changed yarn. The ends will be woven in later. Turn your sock back so you can see the front and the finished shape. Steam the patch for a neat finish, and you're done. In this third and last clip, you learn how to make a square-shaped mend using the blanket stitch anchored to a wart thread across and underneath each row of stitches. This sock has only one small hole in it, but it's really a crucial one since it will definitely rip up the knit if nothing is done to stop it from unraveling. Push the darning mushroom into the sock and secure in place with the string. Thread your needle with a colorful yarn, in this case a light pink that contrasts to the color of the sock. Make a plan for where you want the mend to be. The stitch hangs loose, so we'll secure it before we start mending. Push the needle into the sock at some distance from the hole and out to the front. Load running stitches onto the needle, as many as you can fit. Sew towards the loose stitch. Catch it onto the needle and sew through it to secure it to the thread, and sew down diagonally towards the imagined corner to the left. Start sewing a row of running stitches in a square around the hole. In this case, you do this to know where the edges of the mend will start and end. Push the needle into the knit, pull through, and repeat until you reach a corner. Take a new angle and continue sewing to the next corner. As I said, load running stitches onto the needle, as many as you can fit. It's easier if you do it in a row with many stitches to sew. The mend on this sock will be about 4 times 4 centimeters. When you reach the same corner you started from, in this case the left lower one, start sewing blanket stitches across to the right edge of the mend in a straight line. Slide the needle sideways to the right, needle pointing upwards, and push the needle into the knit and out above the stitch. Wrap the yarn under the needle to form a loop and pull the yarn all the way through. Tighten the stitch between every new loop. Tighten the stitch. If you are left-handed, you'll probably choose to sew stitches from the right edge to the left, since it's usually easier to sew away from yourself, not towards you. But this isn't any rule. You can sew in which direction you choose to. The darner in this video is right-handed. She sews and darns from the left to the right. When you've sewn all across to the right side edge, attach a stitch at the edge and pull a crossing thread over the mend and onto the left side. Attach the yarn to the left edge and start sewing into both the first row of every blanket stitch and the crossing yarn, being careful not to sew into the knit. The reason for not sewing into the knit is obvious. If you do, you'll end up having an uneven mend because the knit is thicker than the sewn stitches and therefore would look very bulky. Repeat the rows of stitches and crossed lines of yarn until you run out of it. Sometimes one thread is enough. That's if the hole or the patch you want to make is small. This mend requires for a couple of threads since it's easier to sew with shorter threads rather than long ones. Long threads gets more tangled up and more often. When you run out of yarn, push the needle in under the mend and out to the front above the mend. Actually, you can push out wherever you choose. Where you do is really up to you. Leave the remaining tail for weaving in later. Rethread and attach the new yarn where you made the last stitch before you ran out of it. The more colors you choose to darn with, the better. Remember that this is visible mending and you're allowed to play with different colors as much as you like. These days, when we have so much of everything and the world is drowning in rejected clothes, garments, and accessories, darned and mended clothes should be just as acceptable as new ones. Giving garments or pieces of clothing an extended life reduces the waste by only a little, but even small gestures make a reason. Earlier, before the revolution of textile industry, traditions to mend and repair fulfilled our needs, but also offered a sense of beauty and of understanding for textiles and clothes and how to use them. Mending were a part of all places, cultures, and families all over the world. We mended because we had to and because we believed we should. In more recent years, our relationship with mending has changed, and for us consumers, repairing, patching, and rebuilding plays much smaller roles in our lives. In most cases, no role at all. Today, we so easily replace old with new only because it's so easy. The industry fostered us to believe that worn-out clothes should be rejected and that it's unnecessary to save them. Fortunately, there are still those of us who love to mend, repair, and rebuild. Let's make a promise to teach our nearest and dearest that it's okay to wear mended clothes, garments, and accessories. And more important, let's teach them how to mend their own clothes, if not for ourselves, but because the world needs it. Okay, so back to mending in this video. If you have large holes you want to mend and you want to use the blanket stitch on your mending, you'll probably run out of yarn a couple of more times than we do. So remember to always leave tails for weaving in. This is really important because if the yarn in the end or beginning is too short to thread onto any needle, you'll end up having a mend that won't hold for very long, since the tails will hang loose. Repeat by sewing blanket stitches and crossing yarns across the whole mend. Finally, When you reach the upper running stitch row of your mend, you'll be darning into the blanket stitch, under the yarn across the row, and the knit. This is for securing the stitches into the knit since it would otherwise hang loose. When you're done with the last row, push the needle into the edge of the mend and out through the sock, either above or beside the mend. Take out the mushroom and catch every yarn end and pull them through to the inside of the sock. Weave in the ends one by sewing into the backs of the stitches. There are different ways to weave in tails of yarn when you've finished working. Either sew into the backs of the mending stitches or into the side of the sock stitches. Remember to never ever make knots, since they are very uncomfortable to walk on. Cut off the end of the yarn. Steam the mend for a neat and flat finish and enjoy your visible mend and your colorful socks, hopefully for many years to come. We used to say that the socks you have loved the most are the socks you will be mending.
And welcome back. Thank you, Johanna, for such a great work, and thank you, Elina, for doing the fantastic work with the darning needle. You're such a magician with that.
Yes, we really have to thank Elina because she was the one who darned and mended in these videos. Unfortunately, I didn't remember to mention that, but I think that this is for maybe international broadcast. So Tarmo will probably add it to the video later, I suppose.
Yes, and this is exactly what I was going to say next, that well, even without these technical problematics, we would have uploaded these clips separately into YouTube, but now there's even more a reason for it. So just follow the Facebook page of Nordic Craft Week, or in Finland, Onni elää käsityössä, and you'll get the links where you can watch these clips later on in your own time and in much better quality than this live broadcast can offer. So now I think it is time for us to take a small look about those the examples of darnings that our viewers have sent us. So
we had a few, maybe?
Yes, I have a few. And even during this broadcast, I got some email
Oh.
and WhatsApp messages. So thank you all.
That's nice to hear.
Yes, excellent it is. And and let's start with this one. The sender said that it's made by her mother, and not only because it's really good looking craft, but there's also most likely sentiments attached, and it is more a reason for fix it if it's broken. And it seems that on this wool sock there's the heel, there's a hole there and very well patched, darned, and then on the front.
Yeah, under the front part of the foot.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
My vocabulary isn't that wide in this context. And here's another. Looks like
this is a woven mend with warp and weft threads that's been woven into the sock, so it looks very nice. It seems to have small stitches outside of the mend. I'm not sure because I see it quite as a small piece, but it looks very nice and very, very colorful. So that's a very nice mend.
yes, beautiful indeed. Harmonic colors.
Yeah, it was. Oh, so this is the square patch or mend we showed in the video with the blanket stitches.
Yes.
Very nicely done.
Yeah, it is indeed.
Yeah, a very bold color with green neon like. So this will look very interesting when it's finished. And these are also made with maybe blanket stitches, I suppose. Was these Elina's socks? Do you remember?
Might be. I'm not exactly
Yeah.
sure.
Those have very nice round patches or mends, probably done with blanket stitch. It looks very much like crochet.
Yeah, and it fits the overall visual
does.
side of the socks. So it's so very well blending in with the hearts.
And these are a bigger photo of
yes,
it.
yes, the same socks from but a different photo. And also you can see that on the heel, there's also on both socks some darning.
Oh yes. On the other one, it's round, and on the right side, I suppose it's mended with weaving stitches. Nice. Oh, so these are the socks from the beginning of the video? Yeah, they are very nice. The more colorful, the better. I like socks with many colors. And I really hope for people who mend their socks to be brave and bold enough to use colors. It's so inspiring seeing people that has chosen to use different red or greens or yellow ones. It makes them look very happy.
Yeah, and maybe all the viewers could post their photos even afterwards, after this session, to the Nordic Craft Week's Facebook page, maybe like commenting this video. That might be one way. It would be really lovely to see more examples.
Oh yes, of course. And here we have the mend with the woven threads, warps, and weave. Yeah. Really nice. Oh, and these are really colorful.
Truly.
Yeah.
It's like almost like a painting.
Yes. It reminds of maybe Klimt.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah. Yeah, and these are very harmonic socks, I think, with blues and whites and pinks. Yeah. And
Yeah.
oh, so on the one of the sock, on the upper sock, it seems like it has a really large patch in it because the mend is so huge. So it must have had a very large hole before the mending.
Truly. Yeah. And this seems to be the last of the photos. So let's switch here. And as this darning mushroom is quite basic accessory in Finland and Norway, it would be really interesting to hear from other countries that is like well known. In the comments, there was said already that in France there has been at least an egg scene
Oh, yeah.
for this purpose, like a darning egg, I suppose.
Yes, yeah, it's egg formed, and they come in different shapes and sizes because if you darn, for example, mittens that has holes on your thumb, then
Yeah.
you'll be able to put a very small darning aid into the thumb and be able to darn with it. So I've seen those on photographs, but I've never seen one live. It would be very nice to see if someone has one to send us photographs of them. So that would be nice.
Yeah. Well, I suppose if I would have a knitted mittens and there would be a hole on the thumb, I could take darning mushroom and put this handle
Yes.
to the thumb and then start darning.
Yeah, you can. That's a good idea.
Yeah. And in general, I could say that now that the autumn is finally here, autumn is the best season for mushrooms, you know.
Oh, yeah. Since you can even dye yarn with it or fabric with every kinds of mushrooms. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. You can eat them, you can dye, many things to do with mushrooms.
Yes, that's true.
So now we are reaching the end of our live broadcast, which gives me a good opportunity to advertise our next live session, which is on Monday at 7 p.m. Finnish time, 6 p.m. Norwegian time. It's about folk dresses in Finland and Norway. And the links are in Nordic Craft Week's Facebook page. The event, this webinar, will be held on Zoom. And for the final comment, there is from Trine. Let's show it. She uses a thick felt pen for the fingers of mittens. Ah, that's a really good idea.
Oh, yes, that's probably a very good aid for doing mittens. Yeah.
Yeah. Can really say that if it works, it works. And this is the always fascinating thing for me, as my background is not originally in crafts. So I started craft making as an adult. So there's lots of gaps in my knowledge, and all the time I found so interesting ideas from other people.
Have you mentioned that you're an expert in bobbin lace?
Yeah, well, not yet. I have this small niche expertise. Bobbin lace making is my cup of tea, which I like to do as much as possible, but it's not topic of this day. But nevertheless, I thank you all the audience of joining us on this broadcast, online workshop of visible mending, and just keep on watching Nordic Craft Week's Facebook page, there will be many interesting things to come. Not that many live sessions, but posts about and videos about different things that might be of your interest.
Yeah. Thank you
So-
from my part of you too. And Elina probably had to leave. Was it so?
Yeah, I was that much rude that I sort of like put her away to ensure that this stream would work, as there was this lagging with the video. So I'm sorry, Elina. But
we
as a
can-
reminder, the clips will be truly published of all these 3 techniques to the YouTube channel, so you can watch them later as well.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
thank you, everybody, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.